Abibi Fahudie, and blessings to the ancestors. It's Deshaun here with a new OPP video, here to discuss the role of the black bourgeoisie by the Western power structure to maintain control over their black and African subjects in Black America, the Caribbean, and the motherland. This video is going to build somewhat off of the integration and black nationalism video, where the objective of those who seek to integrate ultimately result in the moving on up class, who is used to capture and contain the black masses. To start off, let's use a working definition of the black bourgeoisie as explained by Walter Rodney, stating, by and large, the personnel who control the reins of power undoubtedly adhere to the norms and the values of the bourgeoisie in the Western centropoles, but they do not control any capital formations. At best, they own 2 or 3 houses, and they own 1 Mercedes-Benz, plus a Volkswagen, and so on and so forth. But these are not capitalists. Now, the purpose of this elite class of Negroes are to serve as the gatekeepers of the respective societies as token symbols of representation to the lower black African masses on acceptable behaviors, norms, and expectations granted by their white capitalist clients. In doing so, they are able to enjoy some of the fruits that the white dominant society offers, such as token positions within their corporations, political positions of power, and allowing their children to attend their predominantly white institutions, or PWIs, such as universities, or grants to their nonprofits or non-governmental organizations. I'm going to explain later how this produces detrimental results down the road, but let's provide historical data that demonstrates this bourgeoisie dynamic in key regions of the diaspora and the motherland. In the Caribbean, this dynamic was first displayed in the post-slavery period, where a lighter mixed mulatto class of black folk, they were offsprings of their white slave masters and merchants who held significant positions of power throughout the Caribbean as a buffer class. Colin Grant describes this class dynamic in Jamaica in his biographical work of the Most Honorable Marcus Garvey, called Negro with a Hat, stating, those in opposition to Garvey's UNIA were descendants of white planters who raped and enslaved African women, the light-skinned Jamaican elite. They constituted the vast majority of decision makers in Jamaican society, and who were most outraged by one word, Negro, or black. No one, least of all, of the aspiring brown artisans, bank clerks, and civil servants who would have willingly checked off a box denoting their racial classification. The word Negro in practice was an insult. Once decolonization of the Caribbean came in the 1960s and 1970s, a new predominantly black class of bourgeoisie replaced the old elite. This small minority would be propped up by foreign capitalists and former Western colonial powers who had patterned the new so-called independent Caribbean governments on the European parliamentary system, such as the Westminster, that enabled Western interests and investors to maintain their power and making the region dependent on tourism to keep the economy afloat. This same venture would compensate this new black elite by inviting more quote-unquote real estate developers, hotelers, and white tourists to visit. Walter Rodney describes this bourgeoisie element in the Caribbean, stating, the national government of the petty bourgeoisie has little control over production and is endowed with a very feeble political base. They of course have police and military forces which is intended to serve as a means of coercion of the population, but nothing else. The bourgeoisie, out of necessity, will engage the large middle-class sector and a large segment of the working population in parliamentary politics, such as free speech and etc. However, the petty bourgeoisie cannot afford to have any formal exercise in democracy. They do not have the power. They do not have the economic base. They are entirely dependent on 2 things. Firstly, their external support, in other words, foreign support, and secondly, whatever local police forces they can muster. Now, turning our focus to the motherland, at the outset of the conquest of Africa, toward the end of the 19th century, Europeans installed their own bourgeoisie in its new African colonies. By introducing Christian religions and European cultural norms and values, the Europeans used various tactics to groom a class of black Africans to serve their mother country's interests. Molefe Asante describes this process of indoctrination in his work History of Africa, stating, "The French used assimilation, the British used collaboration of some local kings and ethnic groups, intermarried with the local African women, relying heavily upon the creation of a buffer class composed of children of the Portuguese settlers and Africans to eliminate all opposition to Portuguese rule." Indirect rule was a British policy advocated by Frederick Lugard, who argued in his 1922 book, The Dual Mandate in British Tropical Africa, that it was better to use local leaders to carry out the British governance rather than using settlers. If he could not find hereditary kings to his liking, he would replace them with puppets who would collaborate with the British. France also applied this governing strategy by corrupting some of the traditional leaders who enjoyed material rewards because of collusion with the colonizers. Another example of the grooming of an African bourgeoisie is found in the Congo and many Francophone countries. The term ouvrier is a term that's used to describe Africans who aspires to integrate into the overall colonial system. It is described as the native, under French colonial rule, could gain access to the superior plane of humanity through assimilation into French culture and society, with the ultimate reward of becoming an ouvrier. This implied getting rid of one's culture, religion, language, beliefs, and sense of belonging. Of course, the promise of full and equal citizenship dangled by the colonial skin was never actually fulfilled. It was always remained a horizon for the colonized to strive for, without ever being able to reach, and a very powerful means of social control for the colonizer. During the post-colonial period, many of these African bourgeoisie eventually assumed political positions of power due to their Western orientations to the expectations of their former European masters, while assisting to make their newly independent countries client states of the West. Finally, in Black America, the growth of a black bourgeoisie was a gradual process from the outset of the post-Civil War period. As with the Caribbean, mixed light-skinned blacks already had some freedom of movement in the South, but with the end of slavery came a problem for the wealthy plantation owners and northern industrialists on what to do with the free Negroes of America. This gave birth to a new black bourgeoisie who would become the hand-picked Negroes who would form and shape the future identity of the black elite. In E. Franklin Frazier's Black Bourgeoisie book, he exemplifies the formation of this black elite, stating, "Since the creation of these philanthropic foundations, such as the Peabody Fund, until the present, the Negro intellectual has been forced to shape not only his philosophy of racial adjustment, but his general social philosophy according to the social philosophy of the Northern, or in other words, white philanthropic foundations. It has not been necessary, of course, for the foundation to make explicit demands upon the Negro teacher or intellectual. The Negro teacher or intellectual realized that if he were to secure employment, he must indicate that his ideas of racial adjustment conform to the social philosophy of the foundations. This same class of well-meaning white folks will repeat this process throughout the 20th century, financing the creation of either black bourgeoisie-led or integrationist organizations, such as the Sigma Phi Phi, or prominent civil rights groups such as the NAACP or Urban League. Contemporarily, this bourgeoisie is described by the late Glenn Ford, stating, "The current black misleadership class voluntarily joined the enemy camp, calling it progress, as soon as the constraints of official apartheid was lifted," referring to the gains of the civil rights movement. They exploited the political and business opportunities made possible by a people's mass movement in order to advance their own selfish agendas, and in the process made a pact with the white power structure to assist in the disbasement and incarceration of millions of their brothers and sisters. In the case of black elected officials, their culpability is direct and hands-on. What is the end purpose of the white power structure to groom this black bourgeoisie? The end objective is to cultivate a class of black bourgeoisie that will serve as internal agents of the ruling Western class. Instead of the harsher settler colonial rule in the former European colonies in Africa and in the Caribbean, Western countries adopted Frederick Lugard's previously mentioned prescription in a more subtle approach in indoctrinating locals to handle the administration and resource extraction to achieve the same geopolitical exploitative objectives. Instead of being the visible white faces of oppression, they can use their trained bourgeoisie as the black mask, as referred to by Frantz Fanon. In Black America, this dynamic is played out somewhat differently, as the black bourgeoisie are largely clients of the liberal Democratic Party, where they are responsible to maintain the party's black voter majority and advantage in exchange for token symbolism and black appointees of political power and nothing in return of substantive value or policies to change the conditions of the black masses. The end result of this indoctrination is excellently summarized by Nigerian author Chinwenzu, stating, "Young and bright-eyed recruits to elite status visualize for themselves not a lifetime of productivity, but one of security and luxuries and luxurious indolence. It is for the West to produce the luxuries they love. It is the peasants of Africa to produce the export crops or raw materials that earn the foreign exchange, and it is for the petty bourgeoisie elite to use the peasants' earnings to buy for their own glamorous consumption of the West." From my point of view, the OPP agenda will help us break this bourgeoisie relationship by developing our own cooperative economy that's reflective of the interests of the community we help build. The capital we build will be able to finance political systems that represent our wider communities and solve material problems and conditions as African peoples. If you want to hear more about our agenda, you can sign up at ogpeoples.org/join or consider supporting us on Patreon. Until next time, Abibi Fahudiye, and blessings to the ancestors.